Listen, when your boss says you won't get anything, that's just rarely the end of the story. My mother works in an office and these topics are very close to my heart. This isn't just a story for views, it's a real life experience turned into a script so that you can recognize yourself and not repeat other people's mistakes. All names, companies, and addresses have been changed. It's fiction, but the feelings are real.
I knew the game was rigged the second I overheard Scott in the break room bragging to a vendor rep on speakerphone. We'll clear the FCC milestone early. My team's got it handled. I streamlined the compliance back end myself. I was pouring burnt coffee into a cracked mug, standing 5 feet away. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did. Maybe he just assumed I'd keep eating the shit sandwich like I always had. That's the thing about being reliable. People stop noticing you. You become a chair that doesn't creak, a server that never crashes, a name buried in system logs, until the logs are the only thing keeping the building standing. For 8 years, that was me. I wasn't flashy, but I was the reason Harborline passed every audit without a single escalation. I was the reason procurement didn't have to explain why 3 contracts hadn't been re-reviewed under the new data vendor protocols. And I was the one who rewrote the validator stack that Scott now paraded around like his personal TED Talk. By the way, before we go any further, 97% of people who enjoy these stories never subscribe. If this story hits a nerve, if you've ever sat in a room full of suits who didn't know you built the system they just bragged about, take 2 seconds to like the video and hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you think. And trust me, what's coming next is worth it. Now, back to the part where Scott started breathing his own exhaust. See, Harborline wasn't some boutique software shop. We handled telecom infrastructure for over 60% of the Eastern Corridor. The FCC didn't just recommend audits, they threatened financial penalties for non-compliance. And the upcoming Q1 renewal wasn't just a checkbox. It was a full system validation that would lock us in for another 3 years. Missing it? Not an option. Failing it? Career suicide. And yet, there Scott was, spinning some fantasy about how he'd personally led the back-end overhaul. He'd stepped into the executive director role 6 weeks prior and already started floating buzzwords like strategic consolidation and externalization of non-core labor. Translation: he was going to outsource everything that wasn't nailed down, and anyone who still remembered when this place ran on integrity was about to be labeled legacy overhead. I didn't panic. I didn't rage. I did what I always do. I watched. I logged in early. I archived what needed archiving. I made sure the validators stayed clean and the schema patches deployed like clockwork. I pulled one last complete dependency report, noting every module, every chain of custody record, every sub-process only I could run without triggering an integrity flag. And I waited, because I'd read my contract. Unlike Scott, I'd read all of it. I knew exactly what clause would activate if I walked away after completing a recognized milestone. Appendix D, Clause 71B, the kind of clause you don't notice unless you've been around long enough to remember who wrote it. By Wednesday night, I had everything prepped. The final schema was ready. The audit chain was clean. Scott had no idea I was 2 days ahead of schedule, because unlike him, I didn't need a standing ovation every time I did my job. What he also didn't know, that when I submitted that final push before sunrise, Thursday morning it would be time-stamped, archived, and signed off, automatically. That moment would matter more than every fake smile he'd ever thrown in a quarterly review. It wasn't just a delivery. It was a tripwire, and I had every intention of stepping over it. Scott thought he was managing the team, but he never realized the system was mine. 2 weeks out, and Scott was already planning the funeral for half our department. He stopped me in the hallway after our morning sync, real casual, with that too wide smile he used when he wanted something or was about to take it. "You got a second?" he asked, like I hadn't just handed in the 3rd round of compliance prep ahead of schedule. Like I hadn't been carrying the FCC renewal process on my back while he played power broker in Slack threads he didn't understand. He ushered me into one of the smaller side rooms where the whiteboard still had my architecture notes from Q4. "Listen," he started, folding his arms like a man who'd just discovered what arms were for. "After this push, we're going to be reevaluating roles. Nothing immediate, just exploring some strategic outsourcing options." I stared at him. "Are you terminating me?" He didn't flinch, just gave that oily little smirk he probably practiced in the mirror. No, not unless you quit, which you won't, because you'd get nothing. He actually said it like that, like a Bond villain who didn't read the rest of the script. I didn't respond, just nodded, stood, and walked out. That night, I poured a whiskey, pulled out the binder where I kept every version of my employment contract, and went to work like it was a Saturday crossword puzzle. See, I'd been around long enough to know HR doesn't always update the PDFs they send you when the company reorgs, but I kept originals. Printed, signed, annotated, Appendix D, Clause 71B. It didn't look like much, just 3 lines in 10-point font, nestled between equity provisions and NDA reiterations. But those 3 lines were everything. Employees may be eligible for good leaver status upon voluntary resignation if 1. Milestone work product is demonstrably complete. 2. A formal completion packet is submitted prior to final day. 3. Milestone is linked to a contractually binding deliverable or audit window. It didn't promise yachts or stock windfalls, but it did guarantee a defined severance package and, more importantly, triggered accelerated vesting on the equity granted under the Compliance Transformation Program from 2022, the one no one ever read because the project got buried during the CFO shuffle. Scott thought I didn't have an exit strategy. He thought he'd boxed me in, cornered me with fear of forfeiture. But fear only works on people who don't have a clock already ticking in the background. I designed that milestone to be bulletproof, not out of arrogance, out of necessity. The FCC doesn't do second chances. You either validate clean or you get flagged. And once flagged, your partners start asking questions. Your contracts get reviewed, your licenses get paused, the dominoes fall fast. So I built the validator modules with triple redundancy, logged every change, every access point. I wrote the audit logic to capture not just success, but proof of process. And buried inside the compliance packet was a full deployment report with automated timestamps. That's what Clause 71B cared about. Not opinion, not optics, just delivery. All I had to do now was wait. Let Scott keep talking. Let him dangle his threats like I didn't already have my hand on the lever. I showed up every day, polite, efficient, silent. But every night, I backed up the system again. Printed new logs, duplicated the push templates and completion memos. I even pre-drafted my resignation letter, timestamped to match the moment the FCC dashboard flipped green. He thought he was stalling me. What he didn't realize was he wasn't holding the trap. He was standing in it. The final validator process clicked into place like a sealed vault door. 6:14 a.m. sharp. I watched as the last audit trail confirmed integrity across the FCC dashboard. All 5 reporting lanes flipped from yellow to green, like a breath I'd been holding for 3 months had finally been released, 1 click at a time. No errors, no dependencies dangling. Just a clean, immutable push, logged across our system, backed up to the off-site vault, and mirrored in the compliance archive. I even watched the automated delivery script fire off the completion packet to legal, HR, and the executive review board. Everything time-stamped, digitally signed and archived before anyone else had even booted up their work laptops. I took a sip of stale coffee, shut the terminal, and let myself feel nothing. No victory lap, no panic. Just the calm of knowing every move had already been made. That was always the thing with me. People mistook silence for submission, like I wasn't watching their every step from the back row. At 7:22 a.m., I printed the resignation letter. Simple. 2 lines. Attached the completion memo with my digital sign-off and the system timestamps. I walked to Scott's office without rushing. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. He looked up from his desk, still chewing on whatever smug flavor of protein bar he thought passed for breakfast. His hair was too perfect, like he thought he'd earned that shine. He leaned back, trying that power pose bullshit again. "What's up?" I slid the folder across his desk. FCC milestone complete. Compliance packet submitted. He opened it, read it, frowned, then saw the resignation letter clipped to the back and laughed. Actually laughed. "You're serious?" "Effective immediately," I said. "Everything's been filed." He leaned forward like he was about to do me the favor of mansplaining consequences. "Then you walk with nothing." I met his eyes. Okay. I signed the final exit form like it was a lunch receipt, slid my badge and keycard across the desk, stood up, and walked out. No parting speech, no tears, no emotion, just the soft tap of my heels against the tile as I walked down the hallway that still had my fingerprints in its foundation. Let them think I was broken. Let them smirk over their morning coffees, whispering how I stormed out with no plan. Let them run their mouths, because they had no idea what I'd just done. Scott thought he'd orchestrated my exit like a power move. What he didn't realize? The moment I walked out that door, the countdown had already started, and every tick of that clock was echoing straight through Legal's inbox. They just didn't know it yet. Scott probably thought he'd be sliding into his 10 a.m. strategy call like some kind of corporate deity, smug, caffeinated, bragging about how he streamlined operations by pushing out the last vestige of the old system. Maybe he even cracked a joke to someone in finance about clearing dead weight. I imagine he spun it like I panicked, like I blinked first, walked away too early, left money on the table, then Legal emailed. The message wasn't long, just enough words to peel the skin off. Why did you approve her resignation right after project completion? That triggers Clause 71B. Apparently, he called them within seconds. Probably pacing, doing that thing he did with his pen when he was bluffing. Click, 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 like he could tap his way out of liability. I thought she forfeited. She resigned, didn't she? He asked. Legal didn't waste syllables. The reply was cold as steel left out in a storm. Not if milestone delivery is time-stamped before resignation, which it is. ORIX 14 UTZ resignation processed at 0722, Clause 71B applies. She's now classified as a good leaver. Full payout is contractually due. That was it. No wiggle room, no deferment, no HR buffering the blow. Just a straight line from his arrogance to my bank account. He must have stared at the email like it was written in a foreign language. The same man who once mocked my audit logs as overkill had just gotten kneecapped by the very redundancy he refused to understand. I wasn't the loose end, he was. And now, the system he never cared to learn had just kicked in the door and delivered a bill. The payout? Not small. Good leaver status under Appendix D didn't just unlock severance. It triggered an equity clause tied to the Compliance Transformation Initiative, the one he'd ignored, the one buried in the documentation he bragged about simplifying when he deleted half my team last quarter. He'd bragged about centralizing authority, streamlining approvals, killing bottlenecks. And now, that central authority had his name on the line that approved my departure. The timestamp couldn't be rewritten. The system was locked. The board-level compliance portal had already logged the full chain of events. He'd signed off on the one condition that converted my exit from forfeit to fully vested. And Legal? They weren't here to clean it up. They were here to contain it. By noon, 2 more emails had gone out. One to HR requesting immediate processing of the severance payout, and another to finance, flagging the equity vesting clause as contractually enforceable with time-sensitive obligations. Scott didn't speak in the next leadership call. Not a word. Because somewhere in that fake leather chair, he realized the trap he'd laid was never mine. It was his, and I'd just walked him straight into it. The call came in at 2:07 p.m., the exact kind of hour cowards pick when they think Legal won't notice the timestamp. I let it ring once before answering, just once, enough to make him sweat. "Hey," Scott said, dragging the "hey" like we were old drinking buddies. "Listen, I wanted to talk through your departure real quick, see if maybe we jumped the gun a bit." I didn't say anything, just waited. He kept going, voice all warm and fuzzy, like the morning hadn't happened. "I think there's a version of this that gives you more flexibility. If you're open to it, maybe we restructure the resignation date. Call it effective end of week. You know, smooth things out, protect your references." There it was, the tell. Delay formal acceptance by a day. What he was really asking, without asking, was for me to redate the paperwork. Pretend like none of it was final. Pretend like the deployment hadn't already been logged, time-stamped, and filed. He thought if he could buy a few hours, maybe rewrite the narrative, he could get Legal to say Clause 71B didn't apply, that I jumped too early, that I hadn't earned a damn thing. But I wasn't guessing. I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't some junior analyst who'd get flattered into rewriting history for the sake of a LinkedIn endorsement. "It's already filed," I said, voice flat. A pause. "What do you mean?" Filed where? The resignation letter and the completion memo were scanned and submitted to HR at 7:26 a.m. Eastern. The push logs were attached with the validator's digital signatures. Board compliance portal shows receipt confirmation from legal, time-stamped 0731. You can check the audit trail. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear his brain scrambling for an angle. I just think maybe there's been a misunderstanding. He tried again, weak now. We don't want this to be adversarial. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. It's not. Everything's already in motion. He cleared his throat. Look, I don't think you realize the internal complexities this creates. That's where he messed up, acting like I didn't know how deep the knife went. I wrote the system that flagged those complexities, Scott. I spent 5 years giving you compliance headlines you could parade around like achievements. You think I don't know exactly what this triggers? Silence. And then, finally, the real voice, the one he'd been choking down. So you're really gonna take the payout? I didn't answer that. Didn't need to. Because it wasn't up for debate. I wasn't chasing revenge. I wasn't some rage-fueled ex-employee airing dirty laundry online. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I documented everything. Every log, every signature, every chain of custody handoff. I didn't leave angry. I left as a vested good leaver, and they were still learning the difference. The deeper legal went, the quieter it got in the executive thread. At first, they thought this was going to be a gray area situation. You could almost feel it in the phrasing of their first response. Cautious, exploratory, like they were hunting for a loophole they could pin on interpretation. But Harborline's legal team wasn't dumb. Arrogant sometimes, sure. Slow to react often. But dumb? No. Once they started digging through the actual contract language and comparing it to the system logs, they realized what Scott never had. This wasn't a regular resignation. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a bluff that got out of hand. It was a trigger. Clause 71B didn't just grant good leaver status. It executed a secondary provision tied to the company's 2022 Compliance Transformation Equity Program, a fancy name for what was essentially a vesting accelerator tied directly to successfully deployed initiatives with direct financial impact on regulatory renewal or retention. In plain English, if my push passed all validations and started the post-deployment audit clock and I walked after submitting the completion packet, the company owed me both a payout and a bonus grant of equity options. And here's the catch. The contract didn't require the performance to be measured yet. It only required the window to begin. My 6:14 a.m. push kicked off a 48-hour audit cycle. That cycle was the formal benchmark period for the FCC compliance renewal, and it didn't matter that I wasn't around to see the report finalized. What mattered was that I lit the fuse, and that fuse was attached to compensation they'd promised, written and legally codified during a phase when people still assumed no one would ever read the fine print. If I'd resigned before the push, no dice. If they'd preemptively fired me on Wednesday, nothing triggered. If I'd even submitted the completion memo without the system logs attached, maybe there would have been room to argue, but I gave them everything. Clean. Sequential. Locked down with time codes and digital signatures that matched the internal audit matrix line for line. The contract didn't need legal's opinion anymore. It needed a checkbook. $240,000 in severance per my tenure and role classification, $1.05 million in accelerated equity, based on the valuation of the compliance-linked vesting pool. Scott had been so sure he was boxing me in. But the only box that mattered was the one I'd already filled with airtight documentation and automated email triggers, and I didn't need his permission to open it. By Friday, legal had stopped replying to his Slack messages directly. They looped in an external counsel team to oversee the payout structure and advised HR to initiate the transfer under preventive exposure mitigation, which is corporate code for we just got played, and we can't afford to be seen fighting it. Scott kept asking if there was any way to renegotiate terms. There wasn't. The countdown had already started, and the machine I'd built was doing exactly what it was supposed to, locking every door behind me, one by one. I didn't need a lawyer. I had my logs. Just after 9 a.m. on Friday, I sent the email. Simple, calm, airtight. No adjectives, no emotion, just facts, time codes, and documentation that read like a slow, professional exhale. To whom it may concern, I am confirming that all resignation conditions under Appendix D, Clause 71B have been met as of timestamp 06/14/09 UTC. Please find logs, push confirmation, and completion memo attached. I attached everything again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the audit trail so thick they'd choke on it if they ever tried to call it a misunderstanding. The server push logs, digital hash, deployment report, FCC validator screenshots, signed memo, time synced, secured, mirrored to 2 backup vaults, sent to the board compliance inbox, legal, and the HR senior partner directly. Then I closed my laptop and took a walk around the lake near my apartment. I didn't need to wait. The system was already doing what it was built to do, remind them, in increasingly expensive terms, that I was the one who understood how everything actually worked. When the call came, it wasn't Scott. It was someone 2 floors above him, VP of Enterprise Risk. Different tone, no sales pitch, no condescension, just the careful calm of a man who knew what liability smelled like in the morning. He started gently, like we were both professionals just trying to avoid a mess. Hi, I've been looped in by legal to contextualize the situation. First, I want to acknowledge your execution on the compliance milestone. Very clean work. I waited. I understand you've triggered a clause that carries some cascading obligations. We're not disputing the logs. We'd just like to understand your position a little more clearly. I think it's already clear, I said. Clause 71B applies. Milestone was completed, resignation followed. Documentation was submitted and confirmed. Are you asking if I'm open to waiving contractual terms? He paused. No, not asking that. Just looking for a way to handle this amicably, internally. There it was, the shift. They weren't fighting me anymore. They were managing me. I leaned back in my chair, watched a duck glide across the surface of the water outside my window, and let him sit in that silence. Would you be open to resolving this amicably? He asked again. I tilted my head and said, that depends. Is legal still pretending I don't read contracts? Another pause. Longer this time. Then, finally, a soft laugh, not condescending, resigned. No, he said. They're not pretending that anymore. They knew. They'd finally realized this wasn't about bluffing, wasn't about some disgruntled staffer lashing out on the way out the door. I didn't scream. I didn't rant. I didn't leak anything. I just filed everything, quietly, completely, and let their own paperwork prove I was right. The moment that email landed, the story shifted. I wasn't a liability. I was a risk they couldn't afford to mishandle. And Scott? He hadn't been on a single email since. The room smelled like hotel coffee and carpet cleaner, same bland conference center beige, same glass pitchers of ice water sweating onto napkins, same name tags printed in Helvetica and regret. But this time, I wasn't here representing Harborline. I wasn't the silent compliance lead in the corner, scribbling notes for someone else's deck. I was here as Bright Mason's senior compliance architect. Badge, title, chair at the table. Earned. Not gifted. I hadn't even been with them a full month before they asked me to weigh in on the upcoming federal integration guidelines. Apparently, my reputation had arrived before I did. The regional workshop was closed door, vendor only, all telecom infrastructure, and no fluff. They brought in case studies, real ones, anonymized, but easy enough to decode if you knew what to look for. Everyone in the room was some flavor of executive, legal counsel, or infrastructure lead. They were all there to learn how not to tank a federal contract. When I walked into the room and scanned the agenda packet, I paused. Session 3. Mitigating risk through contractual clauses. Good lever provisions and deployment triggers. I didn't have to flip the page to know where this was going, but I did. And there it was, buried 2 slides in. A perfectly redacted version of Clause 71B, labeled Case 0473, Mismanaged Exit Triggers and Post-Deployment Vesting Exposure. I almost laughed. Then I saw him, at the front of the room, adjusting his tie, trying to look comfortable. Scott, right next to Harborline's CIO, who was mid-sentence, mumbling something about proactive alignment of contract strategy with HR protocols. But Scott, he'd just seen me. And in that exact moment, Every drop of color drained from his face like someone had pulled the plug. I didn't smile, I didn't wave, I just sat down in the third row, opened my notebook, and started writing like he wasn't even there. The presenter, external counsel from one of the top 3 telecom firms, stepped up to the podium and clicked to the next slide. "This case study," she said, "illustrates the financial and reputational risk when termination protocols fail to account for milestone-based good leaver clauses. In this instance, the departing employee executed a time-stamped project completion immediately prior to resignation, triggering full severance and equity vesting. Legal was not consulted prior to approval of the resignation, and HR failed to cross-reference the contract appendix." Every sentence landed like a nail in Scott's spine. Someone in the back raised their hand. What was the total financial impact? The presenter didn't blink. North of $1.2 million, not including reputational fallout. I flipped a page. Quiet, cold, still as the grave. Scott didn't ask any questions, just kept tugging at the cuffs of his blazer like he could pull himself out of that seat and disappear. But he couldn't. Not this time. He hadn't just fumbled a clause. He'd become the cautionary tale. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. I didn't need to, because the room already knew. He wasn't the story. I was. 3 months later, I got an email from a former colleague at Harborline, one of the few who still knew how to read between the lines. No subject. Just a forwarded attachment titled Updated Executive Contract Packet, V3.9 Final Draft. I opened it. Appendix D was gone. No more Clause 71B. No more milestone-triggered vesting. Just a dry addendum referencing consolidated exit policies and a note from legal recommending all terminations route through enterprise risk for final approval. Translation. They finally realized how dangerous it was to give precision tools to people who never read the manual, but the damage had already been done. My severance cleared. The equity vested. Every option, every line item, every grant tied to the compliance milestone was executed exactly as the clause dictated. There was no board meeting, no final review, just the system obeying its own logic. The same system I designed to protect them, now protecting me instead. And Bright Mason, we'd just been approved for a $19 million federal rollout, one Harborline had quietly been building toward for over a year. I wasn't just on the implementation team, I was listed, by name, as the lead architect on the bid. The same infrastructure design I'd built the FCC modules around, it was now in our proposal. Just optimized, legally distinct, sharper. At the announcement dinner, my new VP clinked his glass and said, "They tried to cut corners. We hired the person who built the map." I raised mine and said nothing, just smiled. No revenge campaign, no whistleblower leak, no tell-all LinkedIn post, just precision, documentation, timing, discipline. They tried to bury me in legal ambiguity, thinking I'd panic, thinking I'd beg for a reference or cave to fear. Instead, I let their arrogance draft the blueprint of my exit. I walked on the timestamp, let the logs tell the story, let the system do what it was built to do. And when the dust settled, all I had to do was sign, because the win was never in the shouting. It was in the signature, and they gave me the pen.